All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rehab Rules. Today, we are going to settle an age-old debate. What's more important, mobility or stability? And frankly, what's the difference? When I think about mobility and stability, I think we hear mobility a lot. We hear in the fitness space, we harp a lot on mobility, and it becomes a sort of umbrella term, kind of a catch-all. Hey, work on your mobility. Have you been doing your mobility work? You got to get better mobility. And in my view, we often neglect the kind of twin to that, which is stability. I think mobility is nothing without stability. In some ways, we can look at them as being, opposite sides to the same coin. If you think about mobility as your ultimate range of motion and stability as how tightly things hold into a joint, on one end of the spectrum, if you go as far as you can into the mobility range, you've got huge range of motion. You're really likely or vulnerable to have dislocations for joints. The more degrees of freedom a joint has, the less stability it has inherently, or the more it relies on musculature and external factors to maintain its integrity. We all know somebody who lives on the far end of the mobility spectrum who's got incredible flexibility and doesn't work for it. There's actually a measure that we use for that. It's a scale called the Beighton scale. Tests like, if you stick your thumb up and it hooks back, if you lock your knees out and they really hyperextend, or your elbows and they hyperextend. These are all measures of our ligament laxity that we have inherently. These people on the extreme end of the Beighton scale could be considered to have almost pathology in their range of motion. And it leads to vulnerability and, high risk of dislocations, that kind of thing, if they would neglect to work on their stability. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you go all the way to the lowest range of mobility but the highest end of stability, you have frozen shoulder, you have other pathology on the other range. So on either side of the spectrum, you don't really want to go too far. But that's only if you have one without the other. A high degree of mobility with a high degree of stability is actually super desirable. That's what I call functional mobility. If someone has a lot of mobility, a lot of flexibility, but no muscle structure to hold it in place. If I could do the splits, but only if you grabbed my leg and pulled it up over my head, is that very useful? I don't think it is. I think really what we want and what we desire as a human being is to have a maximum attainable range of motion that we can work within. And that's what we're working towards. So for every degree of range of motion that you acquire, you want to be able to work there. You want to be able to have muscle recruitment. You want to be active. You want that to be usable range of motion. For some people who live on the high end of the Beighton scale, you might often be encouraging them to work on their stability because you're trying to encourage them to create a structure around those joints that's going to protect them from injury. For someone else who might suffer from really low range of motion, they might already inherently have very high structure around their joints. Things that are super stable, it's bulletproof. You're never going to knock it out of place. And what they need to do is build some more mobility and some more range into that structure. So depending on where your weakness is, you may not really want to be working on mobility. You maybe want to be working on stability, and vice versa. We all have different needs for our specific bodies and frankly for our specific joints. A good example that we've probably seen in the gym is someone who is maybe a former swimmer or gymnast and goes to overhead squat or snatch, and they lose the bar behind their head because they've got great overhead mobility, but they lack the stability to support it in those positions. And then contrast that with maybe your weekend warrior or one of the masters athletes in your gym who's starting to lose some of their overhead mobility and has, a lot of support, a lot of stability there because it's very defensive and they can't reach those overhead positions as cleanly. These are all the things we need to keep in mind when we're prescribing exercises to people to do as accessories. Do they need more mobility? Do they need more stability? Is it a little bit of both? And you have to work on that from a joint by joint basis, from a person to person basis. It's not quite so simple as just working on your mobility all the time. So to attain the ideal functional range of motion where you can reach every degree of range that you could possibly desire, but also work in those ranges, the question of what's more important to work on, stability versus mobility, really it's both. You want to have a perfect balance between stability and mobility to avoid injuries at any joint level. Now, what's the most effective way to build stable range of motion? There's a lot of information out there around the most ideal ways to stretch to, build range of motion quickly, build functional range really quickly. And, there's no real right answer, but in future videos, we're going to go through some of the concepts that are out there and what I generally recommend to people as the most effective strategies to, build fast range of motion, but actually keep it and make it strong and stable as you do it. All right, leave a comment, subscribe, share this video with somebody that you know who needs this information, whether they've got terrible mobility but great stability or vice versa. Get the information out there, help your buddies out, and then we can all be healthier and stronger moving forward. Thanks for tuning in. Keep working on your mobility and your stability to maintain the best joint health you possibly can. Remember, you're never going to avoid injuries in your life, but the best thing that you can do is be prepared for when you do and arm yourself with the best information that you can. Take care, guys. Stay healthy.